Aho Ponkamo wongi de omba de wiki de go they no hik de wibla Ponkamo adashpa de wanoche Larry Wright Jr. Ijajek te abdi wishti usni ponka si changu lokota bli wakpalinti wongi de wibli stuba wibli ejuba bli legon. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Again, my name is Larry Wright Jr. I'm an executive director for the National Congress of American Indians, and I'm very grateful to be here with our partners at the Native American Rights Fund for this Know Your Rights webinar. I want to start by naming what many people across Indian country are feeling right now. There's a lot of uncertainty, frustration, and outright anger. And understandably, there are a lot of questions. For some, there is real stress and immediate crisis in our communities and the worry about what could happen next. As you all know, in moments like this, it's easy for misinformation to spread quickly, for fear to rise, and for people to feel isolated. This session is intended to provide clear, practical information that tribal citizens and tribal nations can use to make informed decisions and navigate uncertainty with confidence. We recognize that many communities are carrying real concerns right now, and our goal today is to offer supportive, grounded guidance and resources rooted in respect for tribal sovereignty, safety, and the dignity of our people. To that end, we are here today with NARF, one of the most trusted legal organizations in Indian country, to walk through clean guidance and answer questions in a responsible way. And to be very clear, knowing your rights is best used to protect yourself and your loved ones. Knowing your rights does not mean going looking for conflict. It means staying calm, staying informed, and knowing how to protect yourself and your family and our people in these stressful situations. Knowing your rights means understanding what you can say, what you don't have to say, what documents matter, and what you can do to reduce risk and avoid escalation. It also means knowing where to turn. Your tribal government, tribal legal counsel, trusted community organizations, so you are not navigating uncertainty alone. We also recognize that tribal nations are governments. Every nation has its own circumstances, its own jurisdictional realities, and its own approach to keeping its people safe. Part of what we'll cover today is meant to help tribal leaders and staff think about how to communicate effectively with their citizens, how to prepare staff and community-facing teams, and how to connect people to appropriate legal guidance when needed. Finally, I want to thank you again for being here and for the work you do every day. Whether you serve in leadership, work in tribal government, support your community as a service provider, or you're here as a parent or a relative trying to learn and protect your family, your presence truly matters. This webinar is one step in a broader effort to ensure that Indian country has the tools, information, and support we need to move through uncertainty with dignity, unity, and strength. Please remember to put your questions in the Q&A pod at the bottom of your screen for your questions to be considered during the question and answer portion at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to our other panelists to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Larry, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew Campbell. I'm enrolled in the native village of Gamble in Alaska, and I really appreciate the opportunity to provide this important information today. I, along with my colleague Beth, will be giving a presentation on Know Your Rights for individuals, organizations, and also we'll have some thoughts for tribal nations too as well. So I'll have more when we get into the presentation, but with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. It's good to be with you all, and thanks for joining us. My name is Beth Wright. I'm a staff attorney at NARF and from the Pueblo of Laguna.
Bonjour, everyone. My name is Lenny Finde. I have the honor of serving as General Counsel for the National Congress of American Indians. I'm from the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe in northern Minnesota. Today I'll be talking a little bit about the jurisdiction of federal agencies and how they interface with tribal governments. But I'll turn it back over to Matt and we can get started with the presentation on individuals. Miigwech.
Thank you, Lenny, and thank you again, Larry and NCAI. And again, it's good to be here with you all today. I'm going to do a little bit of laying the ground here before we get into our presentation. And obviously, this is a very timely topic for us, unfortunately, because of what we are seeing across the country, but in particular in Minnesota right now with our people. And I think it's really important that we understand what we're seeing in Minnesota. I think that what you're seeing in the news is as bad as it is, it's much worse on the ground for folks in Minnesota, or has been. And so this is certainly a timely conversation, because what we've been seeing is racial profiling of our people, of all people in Minnesota. We've seen unlawful arrests. We've seen retaliation for individuals exercising their First Amendment rights, whether that's observing or videotaping. And then we've seen once individuals are in detention that they're being violently detained with excessive force. They're being harassed and ridiculed while in detention. And we have seen and heard stories of individuals being shackled for hours at a time while they're in detention until they're released. And then, of course, what we've seen with Mr. Preddy and Miss Good as well. So very troubling facts and stories that are coming out of Minnesota, and it is really a dire situation. So I'm glad we're able to have this opportunity to talk about our rights and what folks can do and understand on the ground. Of course, this is an informational session. It's not legal advice. Each situation is different, but I do just want to mention that out front. And then before I forget, I want to really recognize, in particular, folks on the ground in Minnesota and acknowledge all the important work that they're doing. I'm going to put in the chat here a link to the Metro Urban Indian Directors website from Minnesota. They have really good information on where you can go to donate to efforts that are happening on the ground, whether that's at the powwow grounds there in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, or with the Indigenous Protectors Movement. And of course, with the Metro Urban Indian Directors, there are a bunch of organizations involved there as well. So please see their link that I put in the chat there for everyone as well, and just recognize and acknowledge all the important work that's happening on the ground there. So with that, turn to just an overview of what we will be doing, Beth and I will be doing for our presentation. Beth will be covering information for individuals and knowing your rights for individuals. And that will be a good chunk of information for all of us here today. And then I will cover what organizations and nonprofits should keep in mind. And then we also have some suggestions that we've been hearing and thinking about for tribal nations as well. And I know Lenny's also been thinking about that and may have thoughts on that as well. But with that, I want to turn it over to Beth. And again, thank you, NCAI and team, for allowing us to have this conversation. And we'll jump right in. So turn it over now to Beth. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to talk about several different encounters that individuals may have with ICE, but first I'm going to talk about general tips that you can use to keep yourself safe when you're encountering ICE generally. I think it's important to remember that while you have certain rights that you can assert in specific encounters with ICE, you should always keep in mind that there may be other things that you might want to do instead to keep yourself safe depending on the situation. So it's always about striking a balance between asserting your rights and keeping yourself safe. So we'll talk about those two different things throughout this presentation. So I'll start with just some general tips to keep in mind when you're encountering ICE generally. So the first one is that you always have the right to remain silent. You don't have to answer any questions. The second is that you should never lie to ICE because lying to ICE may impact you criminally in the future. You should be careful to not physically resist or obstruct, but also you should keep in mind that you can always record and document any interaction with ICE, but you should do so safely. We are also recommending that folks carry identification on them. This can be a tribe issued ID, a state issued ID, a passport, a photo of your birth certificate. It's just important to keep some sort of identification on you. I'll talk a little bit more about the difference between identification and proving US citizenship, but just so folks know, tribal IDs are a valid form of identification in the United States. And you may be told otherwise, but it's important to remember that tribal IDs are valid federal identification forms. And then also just to keep in mind that if ICE does stop you, it may be safest to comply with ICE orders and to de-escalate the situation by showing your ID or proof of US citizenship if you have it. I'll turn to the next slide, please. So one thing I think that's important for folks to keep in mind is that if you are a United States citizen and you're traveling or you're in the United States, you are not required to carry proof of citizenship while you're in the United States. I think there's been some misunderstanding about whether United States citizens have to prove citizenship when asked by ICE officials. But if you are a United States citizen, there's no federal law that requires you to prove US citizenship or to have proof of US citizenship on you at all times. We are recommending, though, that if you are arrested or detained, that you do show proof of identification, but you do not have to show proof of US citizenship. And as I mentioned before, a tribal ID is a valid form of identification, even though it may not be proof of US citizenship. There's certain encounters with ICE. They can either stop you or they can either arrest and detain you. And if you are stopped by ICE, ICE needs reasonable suspicion that you are not legally in the United States to legally stop you. And if you are arrested or detained by ICE, they need probable cause that you are not legally in the United States to arrest or detain you. And what's important here is that ICE is enforcing the immigration laws of the United States. And so their jurisdiction over US citizens is very limited. So in both scenarios, if you're stopped by ICE or if you're arrested or detained by ICE, a tribal ID or a state issued ID should be enough to rebut those reasonable suspicion or probable cause standards when you encounter ICE. There's a note here that ICE can make other arrests for other federal crimes. We won't get into that too much, but we have seen reports of cases where folks are arrested for interfering with ICE operations or allegedly assaulting ICE officers. But it's important to keep in mind that just as a general principle, ICE does not have jurisdiction over US citizens, and any request for identification is can be accomplished by a tribal ID or a state issued ID. Next slide. So we'll start with ICE encounters at your home. The first thing to remember is to not open the door for an ICE agent unless they present a valid judicial warrant. There are a lot of reports of ICE using administrative warrants, and administrative warrants do not give ICE authority to enter your home without your permission. It's only a valid judicial warrant that will give ICE the authority to enter your home. If ICE says they have a warrant, it's important that you ask what kind of warrant and that you ask to review it. But you should not open the door to receive the warrant. You can ask them to hold it up to a window or hold it up to a screen, but make sure that you just review it before you open your door. We are hearing reports of ICE entering homes without your permission or without a valid warrant. And so if that is the case, be careful to not physically resist, but always maintain that you do not consent to ICE's presence inside your home. I'll turn to the next slide. So the next two slides are examples of a administrative warrant and a judicial warrant. So on this slide, it's an example of an administrative warrant, and the next slide is a judicial warrant. And the best way to tell the difference between the two is that the administrative warrant is typically signed by an ICE officer themselves, and a judicial warrant is signed by a judge. So you can see that documentation at the top of the warrant. And then if we turn to the next slide, you can see that this is signed by a district court judge or a magistrate judge. We are also hearing reports that ICE is alleging that they do not need judicial warrants to enter homes. And so, that's probably an issue that's going to be litigated in the future. But regardless of if ICE enters your home with or without a valid judicial warrant, always keep in mind that you should always voice that you do not consent to ICE entering your home. I'm hearing some reports that people can't hear me very well. I'll try and speak up, and my volume is on as high as it goes, so I apologize for that. We'll turn to the next slide. So this is more information about your home. If ICE enters your home, if ICE begins to search your home without a valid warrant, make sure you clearly voice that you do not consent to them being inside your home or them searching your home. You always have the right to remain silent. And if you choose to remain silent, if ICE is asking you any questions, it's important to say clearly that you are exercising your right to remain silent. As always, do not lie, because lying may impact you in the future. So an example of this may be ICE enters your home and they're asking you where Matt is. You should never say something like, I don't know who Matt is. Matt's not here if Matt is there. And if you do know Matt, you can just respond by saying, I am exercising my right to remain silent. You should always record or document as much of the encounter as you safely can. And we're advising folks to document the encounter in a voice recording or writing it down or telling a friend after the encounter ends. I'll turn to the next slide. This is about encounters with ICE in your car. Typically, you must pull over if you are stopped by any type of law enforcement officer, including ICE. It's important to keep in mind that ICE agents don't always use clearly identifiable cars or clothes. Sometimes they wear clothes that say police. Sometimes they just wear plain clothes. Sometimes they're in unmarked vehicles. So it may be hard to tell who is approaching you or who is stopping you. You're always allowed to ask whoever is stopping you to identify themselves. You can ask what their name is, what law enforcement agency they're from, what their badge number is. They may not provide that information to you, but you are allowed to ask. If the ICE agent or a law enforcement agent comes to your window, you're only required to roll your window down if an officer asks you to. But we are hearing reports that ICE has been opening car doors or breaking car windows before folks have a chance to roll down their window or open their door. So we're reminding folks that you'll want to gauge the situation, and if you're asked to roll down your window for clear communication. I'll go to the next slide. This is a slide about an ICE agent asking for identification. So if you are a driver and an ICE agent asks for your ID, you're required to show a driver's license. And if an ICE agent asks for your ID and you're a passenger, you're not required to provide your ID or any personal information unless you're being detained. But for passengers, we're advising that it still may be the safest option to provide identification or some sort of ID that shows proof of citizenship if you are the passenger. Next slide. It's important to remember that if ICE asks you to get out of the car, always ask for a reason why you're being asked to get out of the car, why you were stopped, and ask the ICE agent to identify themselves before you got out of the car. Again, when it comes to searching your car or your person, ICE usually must have a valid judicial warrant to do so. So if they begin to search your car without a warrant, always remember that you can mention and note that you do not consent to the search. That's the case for any type of search, whether that's your home or your car. Always remember that you can voice that you do not consent to the search. We're getting some reports of ICE detaining or stopping or arresting people who are following them or filming them. And it's important to remember that it's not illegal to follow or film an ICE agent, but if you do so, you should do so from a safe distance and avoid physically obstructing any ICE operations. Next slide. So the slide is about ICE encounters in public or at work. They are pretty similar as far as knowing your rights for both types of encounters. ICE can enter public spaces, including areas of the workplace that are open to the public without any type of warrant. ICE can enter just general public spaces like restaurants or public parks. So ICE doesn't need a warrant to just enter public spaces generally, but they cannot enter private spaces in workplaces. And those are typically designated as employee-only areas. So we are advising folks that it's important to keep an area in the workplace as employee-only areas. If you're approached by ICE at work or in public, do not panic, stay calm, and avoid running or making sudden movements. Once again, if you're asked about another person, whether it's a colleague or another person that is at your work, you don't have to provide any information to the ICE agent. You can also say that you're choosing to exercise your right to remain silent. You're always allowed to ask if you're free to leave. If the agent says yes, you can calmly walk away. And if you're not free to leave, you can ask if you're being detained. And if so, we'll talk about detainment on a slide that's coming up. You can go to the next slide. Unfortunately, we're hearing a lot of reports of ICE encounters with minors, and so it's important to remember for minors that they have the same protections as adults. You have the right to remain silent. You don't have to answer any questions. You don't have to answer any questions about your family members, your parents, where you live. And if you do choose to remain silent, always remember that you can say, I am exercising my right to remain silent. Once again, minors are, like others, are not legally required to carry proof of citizenship on them or identification on them if they are unless they are operating a vehicle. But we do recommend folks carry some sort of identification on them. And if you're going to carry a birth certificate or a passport or something like that, minors may want to put those documents in a sealed envelope and label them confidential. If you are a minor and you are detained and you're detained with your parent, you do have a right to be close and in touch with your parent. Next slide. And these are the slides about if you are detained. So in any of those previous scenarios, if you're at work or in public, or if you are in a car, you may be just stopped by ICE, or you may ultimately be detained by ICE. And so these are the steps to take if you're detained by ICE. Once again, stay calm, do not resist. You can, as we've mentioned plenty of times, it's always your right to exercise, your right to remain silent. You can always say, I am exercising my right to remain silent, and you don't have to answer any questions. But if you are detained by ICE, we are recommending that if you are also a US citizen, you say, I am a US citizen, and ask why you're being detained. We are recommending that folks show a form of identification if they are detained. This can help de-escalate the situation or rebut those reasonable suspicion or probable cause standards that we mentioned earlier. And a tribal ID, as I mentioned, is a valid form of identification. In some cases, ICE agents may not accept a tribal ID as a valid form of identification. And in those cases, you are allowed to ask for a supervisor because it is required that ICE accept tribal ID as a valid form of identification. We'll turn to the next slide. If you are detained, you are allowed to tell ICE that you have medical issues or need to arrange for childcare. And if ICE does not speak your language, you are allowed to request an interpreter for any conversation with ICE. Next slide. We're recommending that folks who believe they may be at risk for detainment make a safety plan, and a safety plan can be as comprehensive as you want, but here are some items that we recommend people include in a safety plan. The most important is memorizing an emergency contact and their phone numbers. Another tip is providing your child's school or daycare with your emergency contacts, keeping important papers like birth certificates, medical records, children's medical records in a safe place, keeping copies of your birth certificate or other proof of citizenship with you, and also giving an emergency contact authorization to make decisions on behalf of your child in the event you are detained. This is also a link to ICE's online detainee locator. So if a loved one is detained, you can use their name and where they were detained to look up where they might be located. Next slide. And the last thing we're recommending for individuals is to document everything after you're released or after the ICE encounter ends. So some of those tips include writing down or making a voice note of what happened, and including things like badge numbers, the names of ICE agents, how many ICE agents you encountered, what they said, what they did, and also we recommend that you take pictures of any damage to your car, your property, or injuries that you incurred. We are also recommending that if you were injured, that you seek medical attention to document those injuries and address what happened. And we're also recommending that you discuss any encounter with ICE with an attorney. And if you have any questions about an encounter with ICE, we welcome you to contact us at the Native American Rights Fund. Happy to answer any questions later regarding this part of the presentation, but I'll turn to Matthew. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Beth. Really important information for individuals to keep in mind. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about what organizations and nonprofits can do, and then also a little bit about what tribal nations can think about before I turn it over to Lenny. So I'll start with organizations and nonprofits and other businesses, right? So businesses also have Fourth Amendment constitutional protections, but there are some unique things that organizations should keep in mind. And I'll go over that now. So generally, police and ICE can enter the public areas of your organization or your business without permission. So thinking of like if you're a restaurant or other business where the public's generally allowed to come in, ICE and other law enforcement are generally allowed as well. But law enforcement cannot enter private areas of your business without a valid judicial warrant, similar to your home. So, what does that mean for organizations, right? It's important, especially for nonprofits that may be providing services, to think about how you're operating currently and whether or not you want to change that, or, if you're currently operating in a way that areas are private, how you can beef that up a little bit. So, one of the things that you can do is designate areas in your organization that are public and that are private, right? And some things that you look for and that courts look for when thinking about that are signs, for example, that say no trespassing, or signs that say private spaces. Those are things that would, tend to indicate that this is something that's a private area that is not open for the public. You can also begin to, keep your doors locked, or create a system where you are requiring individuals to check in if they're coming to seek your services or coming to your business, so that that would indicate, these are actually more of a private area rather than a public. We have a system set up that, we would like you to check in or create an appointment. These are private areas where there's no trespassing, and all of that would help to show that these are indeed private areas that have greater Fourth Amendment protections from illegal searches. Now, if ICE or law enforcement shows up to your business, it might be a good thing to think about to designate a member of your staff or members of your staff that can be designated to speak with law enforcement or police if they arrive. We're seeing lots of suggestions on doing that. And those individuals can be then trained and work to talk with ICE, let them know that this is a private business, that we do not consent to any searches or ICE coming in, and kind of de-escalate the situation. If ICE says they have a warrant, those designated members can be tasked with looking at those warrants in a similar manner, asking them to pass it under the door or put it up on the window. And so thinking about designating individuals can be something that is helpful as well. And then finally, looking at your policies to, create that designated member that may be one that is designated to speak with law enforcement, identifying your policies that you're protecting your members or your constituents' privacy, and that your spaces are private. So these are all things that organizations and nonprofits and businesses can think about and implement. And I put in the chat the link to our website where we have those resources for organizations and individuals to look at as well. It's actually something we at NARF are currently looking at as well. Let me see if I've missed anything here. I don't think so. I think that covers it. So I think you can move on to thinking about what tribal nations can do, right? We've been getting a lot of questions. I think I'm seeing questions in the chat about that. And I think Lenny may have some thoughts on this too, but here are some things that we've been thinking about and put together for you as well. So I think one of the big things that you should think about is requesting and demanding consultation from the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of Justice Services, right? They both have, Department of Homeland Security has policies on consultation, and I have a whole slide on this I'll touch on a little bit. And then the Office of Justice Services has a statutory mandate to consult with tribal nations as well. So, thinking about requesting consultation to inquire about whether DHS is planning to go on reservations. How are they approaching their encounters with your tribal members? We're hearing reports that they are not or accepting, or they're questioning tribal IDs and why they are doing that. How have they been trained on that, right? So really just asking for that consultation to really think about and protect your members and let them know what you're hearing. What are they planning for our reservations or our tribal lands? How are they approaching their encounters with Native Americans and who are citizens of the United States? Those types of things. So definitely think about that. Other things that we are hearing that some tribes are doing is establishing hotlines for tribal members that may be interacting with ICE or that are being detained, right? And so you could have a hotline set up where you could provide information on enrollment or tribal IDs at the ready. Maybe you have attorneys that they can speak to, or maybe you have referrals for IHS or other healthcare facilities that you could refer them to as well. So a hotline could be something that can be immensely useful for members and that some tribes are doing. And then we're also seeing tribal nations set up like ID drives, right? I've seen several tribes go out to Minneapolis and have ID drives. And I think that's a really important and great thing that tribal nations can do. You know, we have many elders that may have been born on reservation in their homes that don't have birth certificates, or they may not have a passport, and maybe they only have a tribal ID, or maybe they have no ID at all. And so while tribal IDs may not be foolproof as we've seen in these interactions, it's at least something that I think tribes can work to provide to their members and that ICE should be accepting, right? That's why we should be asking for consultation on why they're not. So having those ID drives, I think, is a really great idea that I've seen several tribes do already as well. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Couple other things based on our experience, I think, is probably knowing beforehand, at least within your area, where there are ICE detention centers. In case your members are detained, you know, initially it was folks didn't know where people are being taken in Minneapolis and figured out it was the Whipple building out there. So having an idea of where to send an attorney if someone is detained is important and helpful. One thing we've also seen is some tribes are considering bringing on a criminal defense attorney, just having them on retainer for tribal members that may be detained or face criminal charges because of detainment, right? Having someone at the ready. There are also other federal public defenders that can get appointed. And of course, you can always confer with us here at NARF. We've been working with a network of attorneys on the ground in Minneapolis to be able to provide attorneys that can go in, meet with individuals that are detained, and represent them criminally too as well. So we're also looking to build up those networks in other parts of the country as well. But having that in place, thinking about your own networks with your own tribal attorneys, and who they may know in different areas is also, I think, really important and helpful as well. And then finally, you know, if someone is detained, we've been hearing really horrific stories from individuals, from tribal members about them being injured and the ridicule they're facing for hours. You know, having at the ready the services that you can provide and refer them to, whether it's for injuries they may have or for mental health issues that they have to deal with after these encounters, you know, getting those ready and those referrals ready, I think is really important too, and something we're suggesting. And then finally, it's not on here, but I'm seeing a lot of questions about jurisdiction and authority, federal authority, and I know Lenny's going to cover that a little bit, but you know, those are complicated questions. Many tribes have treaty rights that they can lift up, and each tribe has unique circumstances, so those questions get complicated. So I definitely suggest tribes should be consulting with their attorneys to think about how they may implement legislation that enforces their treaty rights or protects the health and welfare of their members. Each situation can be different and it can vary. I think generally, I think it's what we're seeing is federal law enforcement can enforce federal law on reservations, but you know, each situation is unique, and so making sure you're consulting with your tribal attorneys about your situation and what you can do. So let's see, next slide, please. This is my last slide, and then I'll turn it over to Lenny. This is the slide I was referring to about consultation. And so the Department of Homeland Security has specific policies and directives on consultation. You can see the Directive 7104 here referenced. You can find that online. That directive outlines the responsibilities of the Department of Homeland Security to consult with tribal nations regarding their actions. Rodney Lockett is the current Director of Tribal Affairs at DHS. His information is also on their website, but we've put it here for you all to have at the ready. And then also the Office of Justice Services, I mentioned within the Department of Interior, has a statutory obligation to timely and meaningfully consult with tribal nations for any actions that affect public safety and justice within Indian country. So we would suggest certainly reaching out to DHS, reaching out to OJS, and demanding consultation, asking them about whether or not they're planning to come into Indian country and consult on that, asking them about their encounters with tribal members, why they're not accepting tribal IDs, and just getting that on record and requesting that consultation. It's really, our tribal nations have an obligation and are looking to protect their members. And this is one way they can reach out to the Department of Homeland Security and Interior to say, hey, we want to protect our members. They are citizens. What are you doing? Are you coming to Indian country? Those types of things. So that's certainly one thing we recommend. So I think that's it. You can go to the next slide. Myself and Beth, and we have a team here working on these issues. So feel free to reach out as well, or give us a call. And again, we really appreciate it. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lenny.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for that presentation. Beth, for your presentation as well. It's very valuable information. As I move on into my section of the presentation, I just want to start by really thanking NARF, the Native American Rights Fund, for the collaboration and relationship between NARF and NCAI. The ability we have to do things like this webinar, to come together and to really do what we can to help Indian country, to help tribes, and to help Native people in these times that are uncertain. And so I know there's been a lot of information that's been shared already. And so I'm just going to continue on with really a more focus on the underlying federal authority that DHS has, and then how that interfaces with tribal governments. And so to start with is DHS's obligation to consult with tribes and decisions that they make that impact tribal nations or Native people. Matt was touching on this just at the end of his presentation. He specifically mentioned the policy directive at DHS, as well as the Office of Justice Services responsibility to consult with tribes. And so as just for your information, at NCAI, what we have been doing is we have been talking with federal decision makers. We are consistently reminding federal decision makers of their duty and obligation to consult with tribes. I specifically want to go over DHS's tribal consultation policy that was adopted in April of 2003 and remains in effect. The policy heavily relies on Executive Order 13175, and that was a tribal consultation policy that was signed by President Bill Clinton in the year 2000. It identifies consultation in 4 steps, including preparation, notification, input and adjudication, and follow-up and closure. Also importantly, this policy recognizes the distinction between tribal consultation as a form of legal communication and collaboration, as distinct from routine coordination and communication between staff members. And so as NCI, we encourage tribes to reach out to the DHS Office of Tribal Affairs to request consultation if your tribes or community members are experiencing interactions with ICE or the Border Patrol. We can move on to the next slide. And so now I'm going to do a little bit of an overview on the federal authority and the jurisdiction of these federal agencies. And importantly, as a starting point, the federal government does not exercise what's called general police power. Now, police power, when you hear that term, you can automatically think of law enforcement, but police power, general police power, is broader than that. It's the authority to enact laws and regulate behavior and enforce order. The federal government doesn't exercise this broad power. Its power is limited to those authorities that's granted to it in the United States Constitution, primarily in Articles 1 and 2 regarding the legislative and executive authorities of the federal government. And also importantly, when the United States federal government is exercising its constitutional authority, it must abide by the restrictions and limitations that are placed on all governmental actions as outlined in other places in the Constitution. This necessarily includes the Fourth Amendment prohibition on unlawful searches and seizures, which is particularly relevant to our conversation today. Also importantly, under the United States Constitution, that general police power is reserved to states under the 10th Amendment. As I said, in compliance with the Constitution requirements, federal agencies have authority to enforce federal statutory law. These agencies include the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Drug Enforcement Agency under the Department of Justice, it should say, and then under the Department of Homeland Security, we have the Secret Service, the Customs and Border Patrol, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Each of these agencies operate to enforce specific federal statutes, such as federal criminal statutes and federal immigration statutes. And these statutes are distinct from state law or tribal law. And I think that's important to note that they are limited to those federal statutory and regulations or federal statutory law and regulations that are promulgated in accordance with those statutes. So we can go to the next slide. Just a quick look at some of these law enforcement agencies and their jurisdictional scope. We have the FBI and the DEA that are within the Department of Justice, and you can see that, as we know, the FBI sort of exercises broad federal criminal enforcement, major crimes, organized crimes, cyber crimes, etc. The Drug Enforcement Agency, of course, has primary jurisdiction on enforcement of drug laws, including the Controlled Substances Act. And importantly, the DEA has both domestic and international enforcement authority. And then we move into these three. One of these three is not like the other, right? We got Secret Service, ICE, and the Border Patrol. All three are under the Department of Homeland Security. For many, many years, the Secret Service was under the Department of Treasury. And we know the Secret Service primarily as the agency that protects the president, but they also have jurisdiction to enforce certain federal financial crimes, for example, the counterfeiting of money. And the Secret Service is by far and away the oldest federal law enforcement agency. And so it was in the Department of Treasury predating the establishment of several other federal departments. However, in 2002, the Department of Homeland Security was established, and it was established by the Homeland Security Act of 2002. And if we think about what was happening in our country in 2002, like this is in the wake of after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And so this is where Congress enacted under the request of President Bush to establish this federal cabinet level agency, Homeland Security. And there were some new components that were put into this agency, but really it took over a lot of long-standing federal components. The Secret Service was one of those that was transferred from the Department of Treasury to the newly established Department of Homeland Security. Importantly, the authority for immigration was also put under the Department of Homeland Security. Prior to this, it was primarily within the Department of Justice under an organization called Immigration and Naturalization Services. The Homeland Security Act of 2002 transferred all of those authorities under the Department of Homeland Security, including the Border Patrol, which had been in existence prior to this act. However, it established the Immigration and Customs Enforcement as a federal law enforcement agency aimed at immigration enforcement. Okay, we can go into the next slide and take a little bit of a deeper dive now into the two primary law enforcement agencies that interface on the immigration space. So ICE again was established by the Homeland Security Act of 2002, and really it was a conglomeration of duties that were found in other areas of immigration law that were put underneath this newly established agency. But primarily, as it relates to what's happening today, ICE's enforcement authority is to identify, detain, and remove individuals, importantly, who are violating immigration laws. So there has to be a reasonable suspicion that there's a violation of an immigration law to trigger ICE's jurisdictional authority. There's no federal statute or regulation that establishes ICE as a general law enforcement agency, like there is for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. However, there is a regulation that allows ICE officers to enforce federal law. ICE also does not have authority to arrest U.S. citizens for immigration violations. That authority rests with the FBI or state agencies, and ICE may detain individuals for interfering with its enforcement and removal operations. So really, those are the limitations that ICE has on its authorities. It's not, just a general law enforcement authority. And we can move on to the next slide. And the next slide is about the Customs and Border Patrol authority. So the Customs and Border Patrol, as I mentioned, have been in existence for longer than ICE, even though they're also under the Department of Homeland Security. And the primary authority for the Border Patrol, of course, is to regulate who enters the United States. And so that is really heightened when you're at international borders and ports of entry into the United States. One of the things that's really important about the Border Patrol Authority is that they have the ability to perform warrantless stops and searches of vehicles within a reasonable distance inside the United States from an international border. The reasonable distance is defined to mean within 100 miles of an international border or point of entry. And so, even though they have this authority, they see the Border Patrol must still have reasonable suspicion to believe that the individual is an alien before conducting such warrantless stop or search. So there still needs to be something, an articulable fact that the Border Patrol can point to before exercising a warrantless stop. And one of the things that I want to mention here is, specifically, I think about those tribes that are located on our borders. I know there's several of them, like the Tono O'odham Nation in Arizona, the Grand Portage Reservation here in Minnesota, St. Regis Mohawk in New York, and there are others. And they have long-standing interactions, of course, with immigration officials because of their geographic location. And that's where you can see something like the Border Patrol Authority is interesting in how they interact with tribes that are close to the border. But for tribal nations and for Native people that are not located near the border, there really isn't a lot of interaction that takes place on a regular basis between those those agencies and those communities. We're seeing this unfold now in real time, and that's why it's so important for us as tribal advocates, as staff for tribal nations, and as tribal leaders to understand that duty for consultation that the Department of Homeland Security has toward tribal governments, and to urge DHS to engage in that consultation so that those relationships can be developed. I do want to specifically mention here something that Matt had mentioned and something that has come up a little bit in the comments and that we've seen throughout this webinar. And just to state that as a general principle, and again, this doesn't get into the variance and the nuances of individual treaties and statutes, but as a general principle, ICE and the Border Patrol have authority to enter tribal lands to appropriately enforce federal law. They are not subject to the same limitations as state officials. But this is why consultation and developing ongoing relationships with DHS is critical for tribes. Before I move on to my closing remarks, I do want to mention one other aspect that some tribal leaders may have heard about, and this is Section 287G agreements. Section 287G, it's called that because it was a section that was in a public law that was enacted in 1996. But that section allows the federal immigration authorities to enter into a memorandum of agreements with state and local law enforcement agencies. Importantly, this current administration in the Department of Homeland Security is looking at 25 United States Code Section 2804, subsection E, which allows federal agencies to enter into agreements with tribal law enforcement to carry out laws of the United States in order to extend these 287G agreements and MOAs to tribal governments. While that's a decision that each individual tribe has to make for themselves, whether that makes sense, it's important to note that these are law enforcement specific agreements between law enforcement agencies for the enforcement of federal law. It does not substitute for the requirement that DHS consult with tribes. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So we'll move into my closing thoughts before we move into the question and answer portion of the webinar today. There's been a lot of information that's been provided, and we've seen a shifting of long-standing legal positions, roles, and responsibilities unfold before our eyes, both in practices that we are hearing immigration enforcement officers are engaged in, and even statements coming from the United States Supreme Court. I want to mention some of these statements. Last September, we saw Justice Kavanaugh in a concurring opinion in Perdomo versus Nome note that, quote, apparent ethnicity could be a relevant factor in an immigration enforcement officer's development of reasonable suspicion to stop an individual for questioning. This gave rise to implicit racial profiling, and we've seen that play out numerous times in reports that we've heard time and time again. However, in December, Justice Kavanaugh clarified in another concurring opinion in Trump versus Illinois that federal officers, quote, must not make interior immigration stops or arrests based on race or ethnicity. And so in legal terms, this is almost like whiplash, going back and forth between understanding what's the standard, what's not the standard, because we really rely on the courts, and in particular, the Supreme Court, to articulate and interpret what standards law enforcement can utilize. And we're seeing that really shift and go back and forth in a matter of 2 months, for example, in this particular case. And this back and forth in the legal realm creates confusion and fosters a situation where we see inconsistent standards being utilized by law enforcement and decision makers. We really rely on the law to be clear, and the actions we are seeing unfold before us and the decisions being made in all branches of the federal government have created uncertainty. However, Despite this uncertainty, it's important for us as Indigenous people to remain vigilant in protecting our communities. We must always stand together in the face of uncertainty as one. This is where it's so important to note that documentation is critical. We must be willing to advocate for our people, to stand our ground, but to not seek that conflict. Finally, I would just want to note that we have covered a lot of information today. I do want to reiterate that the information presented today does not constitute legal advice for any individual circumstance, and we ask each of you to seek out appropriate legal counsel for your unique circumstance that you may be facing. And with that, I think we can move on to the question and answer portion. Okay, Matt, I'm seeing a number of questions here. I'm not sure. Do you just want me to maybe pick out a couple of questions?
Yeah, I think we got kind of a summary here as there's over 100 questions. So yeah, it's a couple of them I saw, Beth, related to if tribal IDs are not accepted, and it's I think it's somewhat related to our recommendation earlier on. So maybe you can cover a little bit about documents we're recommending folks have on them, and maybe talk a little bit about the tribal ID aspect again as well.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. As I had mentioned previously, a tribal ID is a valid form of identification in the United States, and we are hearing people when they say that ICE agents aren't accepting tribal IDs, but if that happens, we're recommending that folks use or that folks ask for a supervisor if the ICE agent does not accept your tribal ID. Unfortunately, we are recommending that folks may want to also have a second form of identification on them, such as a state ID, a copy of your passport, a copy of your birth certificate, or some other form of identification. As I also mentioned, it's important that if you are a US citizen, you are not required to show to have proof of US citizenship on you at all times. There's no federal law that says US citizens in the United States have proof that they are US citizens on them. And all an ICE agent should be asking for if you are a US citizen is identification. There's it's challenging to talk about every single encounter with an ICE agent, but those are just our general recommendations.
Thanks, Beth.
Thank you.
There's also a couple here, Lenny, about one of the things you just discussed a little bit, and I did too, about ICE jurisdiction on reservations, and then the authority of tribes to prevent ICE from entering reservation lands as well. And I don't know if you want to go over that again. I know it's certainly an important question that folks have.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, as I stated earlier in my presentation, that as a general principle, ICE has the authority to enter open tribal lands in order to enforce federal immigration laws. But that doesn't necessarily take into consideration unique circumstances that an individual tribe or community may have by virtue of their treaty or by virtue of the status of their reservation. And so, as a general principle, as a federal law enforcement agency, ICE does have the authority to enter tribal lands. However, I urge tribal leaders to contact their legal counsel for specific opinions on that may be important as it relates to that tribe's status, whether that tribe's public law 280 or not, whether that tribe's closed reservation or not, and any specific statutes or treaty provisions that may only apply to that reservation or community. I don't know, Matt, if you have anything more you want to say on that, but that
No, I
that
think
would be
that's,
the guidance I would provide.
yep, I think that's spot on. Couple other questions, maybe Beth, this one can go to you too. And we had a slide showing the difference between an administrative warrant versus a judicial warrant. And I don't know if we can go back up to that slide, but there was a question about, kind of verifying the difference between the two. And so maybe if you want to just show that again, it could be helpful for folks.
Yeah, there's two photos here. The first slide is an example of an administrative warrant, and the second is an example of a judicial warrant. Like we mentioned earlier, the clearest way to tell the difference between the two is that an administrative warrant is typically signed by the ICE agent themselves or another ICE agent, and the judicial warrant is signed by a judge. And on the judicial warrant, you can look for a signature by someone who is a magistrate judge, a district court judge. You can look for the name of the court, and you won't see that on an administrative warrant.
Thanks, Beth. Question on tribally owned businesses and another question on employees who work at home. I think the general guidance about private spaces where ICE can be refused entry, for Fourth Amendment purposes for businesses and nonprofits applies on the reservation as well as off. And so, those constitutional rights are applicable regardless. So, in terms of private spaces for businesses on reservations, I think still those same rules apply, right? So, indicating that these are private businesses, there's no trespassing, and setting up those policies and procedures can help protect you to ensure and show that these are indeed private spaces and that a judicial warrant is needed to be able for them to search and enter them. The same kind of general guidance applies for businesses or nonprofits that have folks that work at home. I think the general guidance for individuals when they're in their home will apply for those individuals. And then, for businesses, generally you don't have to provide information on your employees unless they have a judicial warrant to obtain that information. So I think those are kind of the general rules there as well.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I see a question. What kinds of reasons fall under reasonable suspicion or probable cause? I think it's important to note that reasonable suspicion and probable cause are two different standards. Reasonable suspicion is the lower standard, and really all it requires is that there are what's called articulable facts, that the officer can identify and articulate facts that the person may be involved in committing a crime. And for reasonable suspicion, the threshold there is only for a brief stop and discussion or encounter with the individual. Probable cause is a higher standard, and it's more evidence-based. And really, it requires evidence that it's more likely than not that a crime was committed. And probable cause, what the threshold for that and what's allowed under probable cause are things like arrests that can take place or actually able to search an area. And also probable cause is the standard to obtain a warrant, a judicial warrant that Matt was just talking about. And so reasonable suspicion, again, is the lower standard, and really all it's based on is facts that an officer can articulate that a person may have been involved in the commission of a crime. And that's really a circumstance-based analysis.
Thanks, Lenny.
Yep.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't know, Beth or Matt, if you have anything you want to add on that.
No, I think it is just highlighting that reasonable suspicion, right, is a much lower standard. And I think in the context of ICE, it's more about whether or not there's reasonable suspicion that you are in the United States unlawfully too, right? Their
Yes.
jurisdiction is more limited. Um, let's see, we do have a question about Canadian citizens in the Jay Treaty. I don't know, Lenny, if you're familiar with how, the Jay Treaty works and operates. I know this is something we're beginning to look at here at NARF, but I do know, from a basic understanding that there is a provision in the United States Code, I believe it's 8 USC 1359, that kind of codifies the Jay Treaty and allows Native, Canadians, Indigenous folks from Canada to move freely across the borders. But I don't know beyond that. I know that that right exists, and there's probably specific guidance that we're not going to get into today, but maybe something we can look into. Unless Lenny, you have some specific guidance at the ready on that front.
No, all I have is the statute that you pointed to, and I think that's appropriate. It is important to note, I think, that the United States continues to recognize the right of Indigenous people in Canada to cross freely into the United States. That's not necessarily the case. I do just want to clarify that that's not necessarily the case with Indigenous people from the United States to cross freely into Canada, because the Jay Treaty was with the British Crown. It wasn't necessarily with the Canadian government, and so they don't recognize the Jay Treaty doesn't have the same status under the Canadian government as we continue to recognize it in the United States. But we do have it codified, and there is that provision within federal law that allows Canadian individuals to travel back and forth.
Thank you. We're getting close to time here. I did see a question about requests to NARF, in particular if there's emergency situations, and yes, absolutely. I think we've put our contact information in, but we can certainly share that as well. You can see our emails here, but also 303-447-8760 is our phone number. And we are certainly have been speaking on an emergency basis to individuals that have been detained and working with our networks to secure them counsel locally and then talk about their situation. So we are here and trying to be a resource to do that. I know our capacity is limited, but we have a great team here with Beth and Jacqueline, Allison, Malia, and others here at NARF that have been putting in the time to make sure we can provide resources for our people. Don't know if there's any other, I think we've answered most of the grouped questions that have come in. I don't know if there's any that we should flag any further. I'm just kind of looking here. I don't know if you're seeing any, Lenny.
I think there's a lot of good questions, and I think that some of the presentation we did answered some of the other questions as we're going through. I think maybe just important to respect everybody's time. Maybe we can go through and just do a round of closing remarks.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Maybe we can start with Beth, and then me, and then go to Matt, and then Larry if he's available to wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Lenny. Thanks everyone for having us. I know it's really scary, and I know there's been a lot of reports of ICE acting unlawfully. So we hope that you can take some advice from this presentation and gauge the situation to keep yourself safe and your community and your family safe. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Beth. And again, I just want to thank NARF for the partnership. And I want to thank everybody for taking the time to be here today and to listen to this. I do want to just reiterate something that Executive Director Wright said in his opening which is just that as we know our rights, as we protect our rights, that it's important that we don't go out and seek conflict, but that we do what we can to maintain who we are as Indigenous people. And that we're going to be doing everything we can as NCAI and NARF with the resources we have at our disposal to continue to stand for tribal communities and tribal citizens and to protect the rights that we have enshrined within our system of government. And so thank you for being with us today. Matt.
Yep. Thank you, Lenny and Larry, for inviting us. And I know, as mentioned, it is kind of a dire situation, but we've seen so much excellent community come together and organize and be there for each other on the ground in Minneapolis and elsewhere. A lot of our tribal nations are reaching out to see what they can do, how they can provide support, what they can do to protect their members, and just really proud of the resilience of our people. And just know that we at NARF are here to be with you and provide guidance and advice and support to our people that are facing these situations, and will continue to do so. So thank you all.
Yeah, just to reiterate that thank you to our partners at NARF, Beth and Matt, for being here today. I know we had some other folks from NARF on the call as well, and want to thank our staff behind the scenes that are putting all this together, working on the video, the recording of this, and as many of you can see, almost a little over 200 questions that were asked. And it's very difficult to answer all of those in this time frame, but we will follow up and try and consolidate those and provide as much of follow up to those questions as we can. Our team will work to get the video up on our website and our YouTube channel. The slide deck will be available. And for those that were able to see that today, you'll have that availability to get that. And, realizing Indian country is bigger than all the guests we had here. We had over 1,000 people register for this webinar. That shows the interest and importance of our topic today. And so please share that information as we notice that out and make sure that everybody has this information. And we'll continue to update. And I know NARF is busy fielding those kind of questions and trying to stay on top of these developing situations. And so just want to say thank you again, and safety to all of our people in Indian country as we continue to monitor this and deal with this as it affects our people. And do hope everybody stays safe and has a great rest of your day. And we continue to be a resource for Indian country. And please don't hesitate to reach out to our organizations in any follow-up questions. So with that, I say, Gatego Wiblahan Sheno, thank you very much for joining us today.